Michael Sterling sat back, smirking, while everyone else in the courtroom stood. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evans," the bailiff said. But Michael didn't move. "I don't stand for people who work for me," he sneered. The room fell silent. Judge Evans's gaze sharpened. "You will stand." Michael chuckled. "Make me." What happened next left everyone in the courtroom speechless. Michael Sterling walked into the courtroom like he owned it, because, in his mind, he did. His designer shoes clicked against the marble floor as he made his way to the defendant's table, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys in tailored suits. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs from the gallery, reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers whispering among themselves. Everyone was there for one reason: to watch the fall of Michael Sterling, the billionaire whose name had become synonymous with wealth, power, and scandal. Michael wasn't nervous. In fact, he looked bored. His green eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room with mild disinterest. He took his seat slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. His gold Rolex glinted under the fluorescent lights as he leaned back, one arm draped over the back of his chair. His lawyers sat down beside him, shuffling through files and preparing their defense strategy. Not that it mattered. Michael had paid them an obscene amount of money to make this whole mess disappear. He wasn't worried. He had been in tighter spots before, and money had always saved him. A bailiff stepped forward and raised his voice. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Tamara Evans." The room stood. Lawyers, spectators, and even the gallery rose to their feet. The sound of scraping chairs echoed through the room. But Michael remained seated, legs crossed, hands resting casually on his lap. His gaze didn't even lift from his phone. Judge Tamara Evans entered the room with the kind of quiet authority that demanded respect. She was striking, a tall, statuesque black woman with short-cropped hair and piercing brown eyes. She wore the traditional black robes of her office, but her calm, steady gaze made it clear that she didn't need a uniform to command respect. Judge Evans had built a reputation for being fair, but ruthless. She had taken down corporate giants before. Men just like Michael Sterling. And yet, Michael didn't bother to look up. Judge Evans approached the bench and settled into her chair. Her eyes swept the courtroom before landing on Michael. Her brow furrowed when she noticed him still seated. "Mr. Sterling," her voice was smooth but sharp, "I believe you were instructed to rise." Michael's lips curled into a lazy smile. He didn't bother to look up from his phone. "I heard you," he said casually. The room went still. Judge Evans's expression darkened. "Then why are you still sitting?" Michael finally looked up. His green eyes flashed with amusement. "Respect is earned," he said. His tone was calm, but the undercurrent of condescension was impossible to miss. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Even Michael's lawyers exchanged nervous glances. His lead attorney, William Kent, leaned toward him and whispered, "Michael." Michael ignored him. He was enjoying this. Judge Evans's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Michael leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. His smile widened. "You work for me," he said. His voice was loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Let's not pretend I'm not the one signing the checks." The room erupted into whispers. One of the reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously in a notebook. A camera flash went off. Michael could feel the energy shift. Tension filling the air like a pressure drop before a storm. His lawyer's hand tightened on his arm. "Michael," Kent whispered harshly. "Stop talking." But Michael wasn't done. He turned toward Judge Evans with a cocky smirk. "I fund political campaigns. I sit on the boards of half the judges in this state. So, respectfully, let's not act like you hold the power here." Judge Evans's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. Her hands curled into the arms of her chair. She leaned forward slightly. "Stand up," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Michael chuckled. "Make me." A collective gasp swept through the room. Reporters froze, pens poised above their notepads. A courtroom officer shifted nervously near the door. Even Michael's legal team looked horrified. Judge Evans's gaze sharpened into steel. For a moment, the room felt dangerously still. Michael could feel the weight of her stare pressing down on him, but he didn't flinch. He held her gaze with the same smug confidence that had gotten him out of countless situations before. Judge Evans smiled faintly, but there was nothing warm about it. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "you've just made a very dangerous mistake." Michael's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that, certainly not a judge, and certainly not someone who worked for him. His entire life had been spent bending the system to his will. He had politicians on his payroll, CEOs in his back pocket. The law had never applied to him before. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What exactly are you going to do about it?" Judge Evans straightened her back. The silence in the room was deafening. When she spoke, her voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "Bailiff," she said, "remove Mr. Sterling from the courtroom." Michael's smirk vanished. "What?" Two officers moved toward him. Michael's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor." Judge Evans's gaze didn't waver. "You are in contempt of court, Mr. Sterling." Michael's jaw tightened as the officers gripped his arms. He jerked away. "Don't touch me." "Mr. Sterling," Judge Evans said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "you are now facing additional charges of contempt and obstruction of justice. You will be held in custody for 48 hours. Michael's face darkened. He twisted toward his lawyer. "Do something." "There's nothing I can do," Kent said quietly. Michael's confidence cracked. He struggled as the officers tightened their grip on his arms. "This is insane. You can't do this." Judge Evans smiled faintly. "I already have." The courtroom doors opened and the officers began to lead Michael toward the exit. He twisted, glaring at Judge Evans. "This isn't over," he spat. Judge Evans's eyes remained cold. "Oh, Mr. Sterling," she said, "for you, this has only just begun." The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. One of the reporters whispered, "Did that really just happen?" Another nodded. She just put Michael Sterling in handcuffs. But it was Judge Evans' expression that haunted the room. Calm, controlled, unshaken. And for the first time in his life, Michael Sterling realized he might have finally met someone he couldn't buy. Michael's smirk twisted into a look of pure disbelief as Judge Evans' words hung in the air. "Hold you in custody." That couldn't be right. Judges didn't talk to him like that. Judges didn't do things like that. Not to him. He had been in more courtrooms than he could count, and it always ended the same way. A slap on the wrist, a settlement check, a quiet ride home in the back of a blacked-out SUV. But this? Michael's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Judge Evans's expression didn't change. She sat behind the bench, calm and composed, her brown eyes steady as steel. "You heard me," she said evenly. "Bailiff." Two officers stepped forward, their movements swift and professional. The sound of their boots against the polished floor echoed through the hushed courtroom. Michael's lawyer, William Kent, shot to his feet. His face was pale. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His chest rose and fell as anger surged beneath the surface of his controlled exterior. His eyes flashed dangerously. "You can't do this," Michael hissed. Judge Evans' gaze darkened. "I already have." Michael's heart hammered in his chest as the bailiffs flanked him on either side. Their hands closed around his arms, firm, not aggressive, but there was no mistaking the authority in their grip. Michael tensed, his shoulders stiffening as the realization of what was happening hit him all at once. "What the hell are you doing?" Michael's voice sharpened. "Get your hands off me!" The bailiffs didn't even flinch. Michael's legal team was in chaos. Kent leaned toward him, whispering harshly, "Michael, stay calm." "Calm?" Michael's head snapped toward him. "Do something." Kent's expression tightened. He looked toward Judge Evans, but she remained completely composed. "Your Honor," Kent began again, his voice tight. "My client is not a flight risk. This is an overreach of authority." "Overreach." Judge Evans' voice cut through Kent's protest like a blade. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Kent, your client has demonstrated open contempt for this court. This is not a negotiation." Michael jerked his arms, trying to pull away from the bailiffs. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" he growled. Judge Evans's gaze sharpened. "Yes," she said. "That's why you're being taken into custody." Michael's pulse spiked dangerously. His breath quickened. He had faced off with senators, CEOs, and Fortune 500 board members. But this? He wasn't prepared for this. "I'll pay the fine," Michael snapped. "Whatever you want. 100,000, 1,000,000, just name the price." Judge Evans's expression didn't change. "This isn't about money, Mr. Sterling." Michael's jaw tightened, his chest heaved. "You don't understand." "No," Judge Evans said coldly. "You don't understand." The bailiffs began to pull him toward the side entrance of the courtroom. Michael struggled, twisting his arms violently. His tailored suit jacket crumpled under the pressure of their hands. "Let me go!" Michael shouted. His voice bounced off the courtroom walls. "This is insane! Do you know who I am?" Judge Evans's gaze didn't waver. "I know exactly who you are," she said. Michael's heart slammed against his ribs as the bailiffs dragged him toward the door. He dug his heels into the floor, his shoes squeaking against the polished marble. His head whipped toward his lawyers. "Fix this," he barked. "Now!" Kent was already on his phone, speaking in a rushed tone. Another lawyer frantically flipped through legal documents, searching for some loophole or technicality. The gallery watched in stunned silence. A few people raised their phones, filming the scene. Michael's rage sharpened. The last thing he needed was to be seen like this, helpless. "Stop recording!" Michael shouted toward the gallery. "Turn that off!" No one listened. Someone in the back of the room let out a soft laugh. The door to the holding cells swung open with a heavy metallic creak. Michael twisted toward Judge Evans one last time. His eyes burned with fury. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I'm going to ruin you." Judge Evans's gaze remained steady. "Good luck with that," she said calmly. The bailiffs pulled him through the door, and it slammed shut behind him with a resounding bang. Michael sat in a cold holding cell, his back pressed against the concrete wall. The floor beneath him was stained and scuffed. The scent of stale air and disinfectant filled the room. He still couldn't believe it. His suit was wrinkled. His Rolex, a $45,000 statement piece, was missing. His lawyers were working to get him released, but the longer he sat there, the more that gnawing sense of vulnerability settled in his chest. Michael had always been able to buy his way out of trouble. He had paid off politicians, judges, and board members. He had covered up PR disasters and lawsuits. But this was different. His mind replayed the last 5 minutes over and over. The look in Judge Evans's eyes, calm, unyielding, haunted him. He had underestimated her. Worse, he had insulted her. And now, she was making him pay for it. Michael's phone call finally came through hours later. He pressed the receiver against his ear. Kent? His lawyer's voice was strained. Michael, there's a problem. Michael's jaw clenched. What kind of problem? She's serious, Kent said. Evans isn't backing down. Michael's eyes flashed. Then find a way to make her back down. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. We've tried, Kent said. She's clean. No scandals, no backdoor deals. We can't touch her. Michael's grip tightened on the receiver. Then go over her head. We've already contacted the Chief Justice, Kent said. He's not going to intervene. Michael's jaw tightened. You don't understand. No, Kent cut him off. You don't understand. Evans has backing, political backing. Michael's breath quickened. His pulse hammered in his ears. So you're telling me I'm stuck here? For now, Kent said quietly. Michael's heart slammed against his chest. His hand trembled as he slowly hung up the phone. He leaned back against the cold concrete wall, his head falling back with a soft thud. His breath hitched. The walls felt like they were closing in. For the first time in his life, Michael Sterling was powerless. Michael Sterling stepped out of the holding cell the next morning, his eyes flashing with cold fury. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the sterile hallway. His legal team was already waiting. William Kent stood near the exit, phone in hand, his expression tense. The moment Michael crossed the threshold, Kent fell into step beside him. We posted bail, Kent said quietly. You're free, for now. Michael's hands curled into fists at his sides as he followed Kent toward the black SUV idling outside. The morning sun was blinding, and the sound of camera shutters firing like machine guns greeted him the moment the courthouse doors opened. Mr. Sterling, do you have a statement? Did Judge Evans overreach? Is it true you're facing federal charges? Do you think your money will save you this time? Michael's jaw tightened as his security detail forced a path through the mob of reporters. He ignored the shouted questions, climbed into the SUV, and slammed the door behind him. Kent slid into the seat opposite him, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. Michael's hands gripped the edge of the seat. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled. Small details that would have seemed trivial on any other day, but right now they burned like acid. He had been humiliated, publicly humiliated, and by her. The SUV pulled away from the courthouse, tinted windows shielding Michael from the relentless flashes of the press. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, jaw tightening as the screen lit up with dozens of missed calls and texts. His PR team, his investors, his board members, his partners. Michael answered the call without bothering to check the ID. What? He growled. A female voice on the other end was shaking. Mr. Sterling, the board wants to know your strategy. Investors are pulling out. Tell them to calm down, Michael snapped. I'm handling it. Mr. Sterling. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the seat beside him. His pulse hammered in his ears. Kent rubbed his forehead. Michael, we have a problem. Michael's eyes narrowed. No kidding. No, you don't understand, Kent said, voice tight. Judge Evans. She's not some small-time state judge. She's been appointed to the Federal Oversight Committee. Michael's eyes flashed. So, Kent continued. She's one of the toughest judges in the country. Political ties. Judicial backing. She's practically bulletproof. Michael scoffed. Everyone has a price. Not her. Kent's voice darkened. We've already looked into it. She's clean. No scandals. No weaknesses. Michael's lips curled into a sneer. Then find one. Kent hesitated. We've already tried. Michael's head snapped toward him. And? She's untouchable, Kent said quietly. Michael's chest tightened. He leaned back against the leather seat, his hand running over his jaw. His mind raced. I've spent my entire life bending the system, Michael said, his voice low. Judges, politicians, they all play the game. Kent didn't say anything. Michael's gaze sharpened. You're telling me this woman, this nobody, is going to ruin me? She's not a nobody, Kent said. And she's not bending. Michael's teeth clenched. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Powerful names flashed across the screen. Senators, lobbyists, corporate giants. Michael Sterling had spent his life collecting favors. He always had an ace up his sleeve. He dialed a number. A man answered almost immediately. Michael? I need you to make a call, Michael said. Find someone who can get to Evans. The man on the other end hesitated. Michael, this could backfire. I don't care, Michael hissed. Do it. Michael ended the call and stared out the window as the city skyline blurred past. His mind was already calculating, planning his next move. Michael's penthouse was on the 48th floor of a luxury building overlooking the city. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline perfectly, a visual reminder of the empire he had built. He stormed through the entrance, ripping off his suit jacket and tossing it over a leather chair. The penthouse was sleek and modern, minimalist furniture, black and gray tones, cold lighting. His staff, sensing his mood, quickly disappeared from view. Michael strode toward the marble counter, poured himself a glass of scotch, and downed it in one gulp. His phone rang. Kent again. Michael picked up. Tell me you have something. There's nothing, Kent said. Evans is clean. No skeletons in the closet. No questionable rulings. No political scandals. Michael's hand tightened around the glass. Michael, Kent's voice lowered. You may need to consider settling. Michael's head snapped toward the phone. Excuse me? If we cooperate, I'm not giving her the satisfaction, Michael growled. Do you have any idea what it would mean if I folded? I'm telling you the reality of the situation, Kent said. Evans isn't going to back down. Michael's grip tightened. Then I'll break her. There was a pause on the other end of the line. And how exactly are you going to do that? Michael's eyes darkened. By playing the only game I know how to win. That night, Michael met with his most powerful allies in the private dining room of an exclusive club. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and low golden light reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware. A senator leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of bourbon. So this judge, Evans? She's a problem, Michael said coldly. A man in a tailored suit leaned forward. What's your play? Michael's gaze sharpened. Pressure. A woman in pearls smiled faintly. Meaning? Political pressure, Michael said. Career sabotage. Make her life so difficult that she backs off. And if she doesn't? Michael's eyes darkened. She will. There was a pause. The senator smiled. We'll make a few calls. Michael leaned back, confidence returning to his expression. The tide was about to turn. The next morning, Michael sat in his penthouse reading the paper. The front page headline, Billionaire Michael Sterling faces criminal trial, Judge Evans to oversee case. Michael's lip curled into a faint smirk. He picked up his phone and dialed Kent. Well, we've put pressure on 3 senators, Kent said. Evans's name is circulating through political channels. She's going to feel it. Michael smiled. Good. Kent hesitated. Michael, there's a problem. Michael's brow furrowed. What now? Evans isn't backing down. Michael's smile faded. What are you talking about? Michael. Kent's voice sharpened. We've seen this before, but Evans isn't scared. Michael's chest tightened. His gaze flicked toward the skyline. She will be, he said coldly. Michael Sterling had built his empire by crushing obstacles. Tamara Evans was about to become the next one, or so he thought. Michael Sterling walked into the courtroom with a dangerous smile on his face. His confidence was back, sharper than ever. He was dressed in a custom-made charcoal suit, his green eyes glinting under the fluorescent lights. His high-powered legal team flanked him like a protective wall, their briefcases in hand, their tailored suits crisp and spotless. The press had swarmed the courthouse steps that morning, snapping photos and shouting questions as Michael stepped out of his black SUV. He had smiled for the cameras, a calculated, controlled smile, and had made sure the flash caught the glint of his Rolex. The narrative was shifting. His PR team had worked around the clock to turn the story in his favor. Political bias. A judge with a personal vendetta. Targeted because of his success. It was working. The headlines were starting to lean in his direction. Talk shows debated whether Judge Evans was being too harsh. Michael's allies in the business world were putting pressure on the political system. Senators were starting to whisper about judicial overreach. The cracks were forming. Michael had been through worse before. Money always fixed the problem, and today would be no different. He strolled into the courtroom, flashing a slight smirk as he scanned the gallery. Packed. Reporters lined the back rows. Some of the most powerful corporate figures in the country sat behind them. Some friends, some enemies, all curious to see how this would play out. Michael could feel their eyes on him. He liked it. Judge Evans sat behind the bench, her expression cool and unreadable. She wore her black robes like armor, her dark brown eyes focused on him as he approached the defendant's table. Michael's gaze locked with hers. For a brief second, he thought he saw something in her eyes. Not doubt, not fear, but calculation. That made him smile even wider. Judge Evans picked up her gavel and struck it against the wooden block. "Court is now in session," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled. Michael took his seat and leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. His lawyer, Kent, sat beside him and placed a folder on the table. Michael didn't bother looking at it. He already knew the plan. His team had arranged for key pieces of evidence to disappear. Quietly, of course. A few phone calls, some pressure on the right people, nothing traceable. His legal team had built a flawless defense. His PR team had been working overtime, positioning Michael as the victim of a politically motivated attack. It was all going to fall apart for Evans. Michael's eyes flicked toward her. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Judge Evans adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady, "you've repeatedly demonstrated contempt for this court and the legal system." Michael's smile widened. He sat back in his chair. "With all due respect, Your Honor." "I'm not finished." Judge Evans cut him off. Michael's smile faltered. Judge Evans picked up a file from her desk. "Therefore," she continued, "I have ordered a full forensic audit of your financial records and business dealings, including offshore accounts." Michael's smile froze. The air in the courtroom shifted, a subtle but dangerous shift. The sound of pens scratching across notepads stopped. Michael's legal team visibly stiffened. Kent's hand tightened on the folder in front of him. Michael's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Judge Evans' gaze sharpened. "I've already spoken with the Internal Revenue Service," Judge Evans said. "They have agreed to open a formal investigation into your financial records." Michael's chest tightened. He sat up straighter. His eyes darted toward Kent. His lawyer's face had gone white. "And," Judge Evans continued, her tone razor-sharp, "in light of new evidence brought to this court, this case will now proceed to a full criminal trial." Michael's hand curled into a fist. "You can't do that," he said sharply. Judge Evans' lips twitched into a slight smile. "I already have," she said. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering harshly. "They can't open a federal case without—" "She just did," Michael hissed. His eyes locked onto Judge Evans, rage and disbelief twisting through his chest. "I'd advise you to speak carefully, Mr. Sterling," Judge Evans said, "because at this point, you're not fighting a lawsuit." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Judge Evans leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming like polished steel. "Meaning," she said, "if this case proceeds, and if you are convicted, you will be facing a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison." Michael's stomach dropped. His confidence flickered. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You can't do this," he said again, but this time his voice was quieter. Judge Evans's gaze didn't waver. "Your bail is revoked, effective immediately." Michael shot to his feet. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. Kent grabbed his arm. "Michael!" Michael ignored him. "This is a joke. This is political. I have rights." "You had rights," Judge Evans said. "You threw them away." Two bailiffs moved toward him. Michael's breath quickened. His chest tightened painfully. Michael shook his head. "This won't stand. I'll have you disbarred. Bailiffs," Judge Evans said calmly. The officers seized Michael's arms. His pulse spiked dangerously. His body tensed as the bailiffs pulled him toward the exit. "I'm not done," Michael shouted. "Oh, you are," Judge Evans said. "Take him away." The doors swung open with a sharp metallic creak. The gallery erupted into whispers. Cameras flashed. Michael twisted toward his lawyer. "Fix this." Kent's expression was blank, pale. He shook his head slightly. "Michael," Kent said, his voice barely audible. "We lost." Michael's blood turned cold. His head whipped toward Judge Evans, who sat motionless behind the bench, her hands resting on the polished wood. "You can't win," Michael growled. Judge Evans's eyes narrowed. "Watch me," she said. The bailiffs pulled him through the door. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom like the toll of a bell. Michael's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. For the first time in his life, Michael Sterling realized that money wasn't going to save him. And Judge Evans knew it too. Michael Sterling sat in the gray-walled holding cell, his back pressed against the cold concrete. His suit jacket was gone. His crisp white dress shirt was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair, always styled with surgical precision, was now a mess. The sharp scent of bleach and industrial cleaner lingered in the air. The metal bench beneath him dug into his spine, but he didn't move. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white. His pulse was hammering in his ears. This couldn't be happening. Michael had been in tough situations before. Lawsuits, federal investigations, stock crashes. But it had never gone this far. He had always been able to buy his way out of trouble, to bend the system to his advantage. Money always solved the problem. But not this time. His lawyer, Kent, sat across from him on the other side of the glass partition, his expression tight and grim. The phone that connected them crackled faintly in Michael's ear. "You need to start preparing for the real possibility of a conviction," Kent said, his voice low and flat. Michael's jaw tightened. "That's not happening." Kent sighed, rubbing his hand over his jaw. "Michael, they're not backing down. Evans has the IRS on this. The forensic team found records, offshore accounts, wire transfers to shell companies. And the political pressure, it's backfiring. The more you push, the more the media's turning on you." Michael's hand tightened around the receiver. "Fix it." "I can't," Kent said. "No one can." Michael's eyes darkened. "Then find someone who can." Kent shook his head. "Michael, You're out of moves." Michael's chest tightened painfully. His heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned forward until his forehead almost touched the glass. "I don't lose," Michael growled. "Do you understand me? I've never lost." Kent's gaze sharpened. "You're not up against the market, Michael. You're not dealing with a hostile takeover or a lawsuit. This is criminal court." Michael's hand slammed against the glass. Kent didn't even flinch. "Figure it out," Michael hissed. Kent's gaze remained cold. "It's too late." Michael's throat tightened. His breath hitched. His mind was racing, running through 100 different scenarios. Who to call, who could still be bought, but he kept running into the same wall. Evans. She was unbreakable, untouchable. Michael leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. This couldn't be happening. This could not be happening. Kent's voice came through the receiver again. "The trial starts in 2 days." Michael's eyes opened slowly. "I'm not losing," Michael said through clenched teeth. Kent's gaze remained steady. "We'll see." Michael's release came 48 hours later. Temporary freedom, but the walls were closing in fast. He returned to his penthouse, but it didn't feel like his anymore. The skyline stretched out before him through the glass walls, the city's lights blinking in the distance. But the usual sense of power, of control, was gone. His phone was still ringing. His email inbox was flooded. His stock was collapsing. 3 board members had already resigned. Michael sat in the dark, a glass of scotch in hand, his gaze fixed on the city lights. His mind raced, running through every scenario, every angle, but no solution presented itself. He had called in every favor. He had paid off everyone who could be paid. He had backed Evans into a corner, and yet she hadn't flinched. Kent's words echoed in his head. "She's not bending." Michael's grip tightened around the glass. He had spent his life controlling the boardroom, commanding the room, making men twice his age beg for his attention. He had climbed over everyone in his path, crushed rivals, destroyed competitors. But this was different. Evans wasn't playing the game. Michael's phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. Senator Halford. Michael answered. "Talk." Halford's voice was tight. "We've got a problem." Michael's eyes darkened. "What problem?" "You pushed too hard," Halford said. "There's pressure from the DOJ now. The feds are looking into you. If Evans pushes this to trial, you could be looking at RICO charges." Michael's pulse spiked dangerously. "That's impossible." "No, it's not," Halford said. "Evans knows exactly what she's doing. You're not just fighting a lawsuit anymore. You're fighting the government." Michael stood, his breath coming in sharp bursts. His free hand slammed into the counter. "Then stop it," Michael growled. "I can't," Halford said. "No one can." Michael's hand trembled. He hung up and tossed the phone onto the counter. His chest rose and fell rapidly. The walls of the penthouse felt too small, the city lights outside too distant. He ran a hand over his face, dragging it down his jaw. This couldn't be happening. Michael took a shaky breath. His eyes narrowed. "She thinks she's going to beat me." Michael's lips curled into a dark smile. "Let's see how long that lasts." Court resumed 2 days later. Michael walked in wearing a navy suit, his expression cool and composed. His legal team flanked him as he took his seat at the defendant's table. Judge Evans sat behind the bench, calm as ever. Her gaze flicked toward Michael. Michael met her eyes and smiled faintly. Judge Evans didn't react. The prosecution stood and began laying out their case. Evidence of tax fraud, offshore accounts, hidden wire transfers. The financial records that Michael had paid so much to keep hidden were now in full view of the court. Michael's lawyers objected. Judge Evans overruled them every time. Michael sat back, his expression carefully blank. He could feel the pressure mounting, the shifting energy in the room. The gallery was packed. Reporters whispered to each other. He saw cameras aimed at his face. When the prosecution finished presenting the evidence, Judge Evans turned toward Michael. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice sharp and controlled, "would you like to respond?" Michael's lips curled into a faint smile. He stood slowly. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Michael said, "this is clearly an overreach." Judge Evans' gaze sharpened. "Overreach?" she said coolly. "You've stolen from investors, lied under oath, obstructed justice, and now you're claiming this is an overreach?" Michael's smile widened. "That's exactly what I'm claiming." Judge Evans' eyes darkened. Michael leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Respectfully," Michael said, "I'm untouchable." Judge Evans didn't blink. Her expression remained perfectly calm. "We'll see," she said. Michael's smile widened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had come back from worse. He had beaten bigger enemies. Tamara Evans wasn't going to break him. Michael sat back in his chair and crossed his legs. His smile remained. The game was just beginning. Michael Sterling stood behind the thick glass partition of the holding cell, his wrists shackled in front of him. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the gallery filled to capacity. Reporters, photographers, and spectators whispered to one another, clutching notebooks and cameras. The trial had become a media circus. Headlines screamed across every major outlet, and every news cycle revolved around the fall of Michael Sterling. Michael's once pristine suit was slightly rumpled, but he still held himself with that same air of quiet arrogance. His sharp green eyes scanned the courtroom as though he still owned it. His legal team was already seated at the defense table, Kent sitting at the head, flipping through a stack of papers with grim focus. When the bailiffs finally led Michael through the side entrance and toward the defendant's table, the whispers in the gallery grew louder. He ignored them. His gaze was locked on one person, Judge Tamara Evans. She sat behind the bench, her expression calm, composed, unshakable as always. Her brown eyes followed Michael as he was seated, her gaze steady. Michael lifted his chin, forcing a faint smile. He wasn't beaten yet. Judge Evans picked up her gavel and struck it once. The room fell silent. "Court is now in session," she said. Michael leaned toward Kent and whispered, "What's the angle?" Kent didn't look up. "We've filed 3 motions for dismissal. Denied. We requested a change of venue. Denied. They have enough evidence for a conviction, Michael. You need to be prepared." Michael's smile tightened. "I'm not going to prison. Kent's eyes darkened. "Michael?" "Figure it out," Michael hissed. Kent sat back, his expression cold. "We're out of moves." Michael's jaw clenched. His pulse hammered beneath his skin. This wasn't happening. This couldn't happen. He had spent his life breaking obstacles, outsmarting opponents, owning the room. But this time, the room wasn't bending. Evans wasn't bending. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Evans's voice cut through the silence. "Please stand." Michael's gaze sharpened. He rose slowly, straightening his spine. His confidence returned in an instant. He could talk his way out of this. He always did. Judge Evans's eyes narrowed slightly. "The court has reached a verdict," she said. Michael's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Michael Sterling," Judge Evans said, her voice cold and unwavering. "You have been found guilty on multiple counts of securities fraud, insider trading, and obstruction of justice." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Michael's head snapped toward Kent, his expression hardening. Kent didn't move. "Sentencing will begin immediately," Judge Evans continued. Michael's eyes flashed. "You can't." "I already have," Judge Evans said. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Michael's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His gaze darted toward the gallery. Cameras flashed. A woman in the front row shook her head in disbelief. A man whispered to the person beside him, "He actually lost." Michael's heart hammered painfully against his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the plan. He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. He still had connections, appeals, loopholes. He could make this go away. He just needed time. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Evans' voice cut through his thoughts, "do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." Judge Evans's lips twitched. "No, Mr. Sterling," she said. "You made the mistake." Michael's eyes darkened. He leaned toward the microphone. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Judge Evans's gaze sharpened. "Yes," she said. "I've restored justice." The room buzzed with quiet tension. Michael's breathing sharpened. His chest rose and fell with the effort to keep his composure. Judge Evans adjusted her glasses. "You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison." Gasps exploded through the room. Michael's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. "Additionally," Judge Evans continued, "you are fined $50 million in restitution to the victims of your schemes." Michael's chest tightened painfully. His face paled. Judge Evans leaned forward slightly. "This court finds you responsible for the largest financial fraud case of the decade." Michael's jaw tightened. He twisted toward Kent. "Fix this!" Kent shook his head. "Michael, it's over." "No," Michael hissed. "No, it's not." Judge Evans' gaze remained calm. "Bailiffs," she said. The officers approached. Michael's pulse spiked dangerously. His hands curled into fists as they gripped his arms. "You can't do this," Michael growled as they pulled him back. "I already have," Judge Evans said. Michael's gaze burned into hers. His jaw tightened, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "I'll fight this," Michael spat. "I'll tear this court apart." Judge Evans's gaze sharpened. "No, Mr. Sterling," she said calmly. "You'll sit down." The officers pulled Michael toward the door. His shoes squeaked against the marble floor as they dragged him backward. Michael's gaze remained fixed on Judge Evans. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him. The humiliation, the disbelief, the finality of it. The doors swung open with a loud creak. Michael twisted toward the gallery one last time. A woman near the back smiled faintly. A man whispered to his companion, "He's done." Michael's pulse hammered violently in his ears. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. He fought against the officer's grip, but it didn't matter. For the first time in his life, Michael Sterling had lost. The doors slammed shut behind him. A month later, Judge Evans sat in her chambers. The office was quiet, the soft hum of city traffic filtering through the windows. She sat at her desk, a neat stack of files to her left. Her hand hovered over a glass of water as her clerk entered. "Judge Evans?" Tamara Evans looked up. "Yes?" The clerk hesitated. Michael Sterling's appeal was denied. Judge Evans's expression didn't change. "Of course it was." The clerk smiled. "Regardless, you made history." Judge Evans picked up her pen and returned to her paperwork. "It's not about history," she said. "It's about justice." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps, discussing the outcome of the case. Across the country, headlines declared Michael Sterling's downfall. Billionaire brought to his knees. Michael Sterling sentenced to 15 years. He stared down at his hands, his bare wrists. Michael Sterling had finally learned the one truth his money could never change. No one is above the law.